On February 27th, 2025, a man in his 30s named John grabbed a drink out of his fridge in his kitchen and then walked into his living room. He had just finished work and his wife and kids were out visiting his in-laws, and so tonight he was excited to just sit on the couch and watch TV. As he sat down, he called out to his dog. There was a huge thunderstorm outside, and he knew his dog was deathly afraid of thunder, and so he expected her to come running as soon as she heard her name. But after he called her, he heard nothing. But this didn't worry him because he figured, his dog must have found a good hiding spot and had just fallen asleep there. So John turned his attention to the TV and began looking for a horror movie to watch. But as he did, he started thinking about his wife and his kids driving home that night, and he was worried about them, because of the weather. So instead of clicking on a horror movie, he turned to the local news to check on the weather. However, as soon as the local news came on, it was not the weather they were talking about, despite this being a major storm. This should have kind of dominated the news, but it wasn't. Instead, there was a much bigger story on the news right now, and that was there was this huge riot happening at a state prison that was only 10 miles away from where John lived, and apparently the most dangerous convict at this prison had escaped. The newscasters began to describe this convict, and they said he actually had a nickname the other prisoners had given him. They called him the Monster of Cell Block C. Now, this nickname had to do in part with the fact that he was just a horrible criminal, like people were scared of him. And then also, the nickname came from his just totally bizarre and threatening behavior. He would routinely sit in the corner of his cell and eat insects off the ground. And then also, he kept jumping on prison guards every chance he got, which got him thrown in solitary confinement, where he just continued to eat the insects there and act totally unhinged. But perhaps the biggest reason he was dubbed the Monster of Cell Block C is because of his appearance. He had these crazy bulging eyes and this really thick neck. It made him look totally deformed. The anchors were telling locals to stay vigilant because the police had no idea where the Monster of Cell Block C was. Maybe he was still at the prison, but it did seem entirely possible that he really had escaped. And then it seemed like the anchors were about to put a picture up of the actual inmate himself, when suddenly John heard this huge boom of thunder outside, and then the power in his house just completely cut out, so the TV shut off. He didn't get to see what the inmate looked like. John instinctively reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to use the flashlight feature, but his phone was dead. It had died like a couple minutes earlier, and he had told himself, I gotta plug this phone in, but he just hadn't done it yet, and now the power's out. So he has no light source. And on top of that, John couldn't help but feel sort of rattled. He had just heard on the news that, the Monster of Cell Block C has escaped 10 miles away, and now the power's out at his house in the middle of a storm, and he's all alone. But at the same time, John told himself, everything's fine. It's just a coincidence here that the power's gone out right at this moment. I'm fine. The state prison, it's 10 miles away. And why would this convict have any interest coming to my house? So I'm fine. And so John stood up and began heading towards his kitchen where he knew he kept a flashlight. But as he got close to the kitchen, he heard a strange sound. It was an electronic ding, like a phone notification sound. But at the same time, John really couldn't quite place it. And he also knew it couldn't be his phone because his phone was dead. However, he thought maybe it's my kids' iPads. After all, the sound he was hearing, the more he listened, he could tell it was coming from upstairs, and that's where his kids' iPads were. However, the sound still seemed really weird to John because it started suddenly, basically right after the power went out. He hadn't heard it before that. And also, if these were, notification sounds on his kids' iPads, you would think there would only be maybe 1 or 2 notifications. You wouldn't have, a string of notification sounds. But as John listened, he heard like this incessant amount of dinging coming from the upstairs. And it wasn't constant. It was sort of sporadic, like random dings kind of all over the place. But then John remembered that his kids' iPads had a messaging app on it so they could talk to their parents. And John remembered that, his phone is dead, his wife could be out there driving in the storm, and so maybe she was trying to get in touch with him, couldn't because his phone was dead, and so now she was trying to message him using their kids' iPads. And so suddenly his heart rate began to pick up, he ran into the kitchen, he grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and he ran to the base of the stairs that led up to the second floor. And as he began ascending the stairs, he's hearing that dinging sound over and over and over again. He knows it's from somewhere upstairs, and he can't help but feel totally anxious about it, like he can't place it. It kind of sounds like an iPad, but at the same time, it doesn't. He doesn't really know what it is. And so up the stairs he goes, he's scanning all around. There's no movement in the house. He still hasn't seen his dog. He gets to the top of the stairs, and in their house, there was this hallway that ran right and left from the top of the stairs. John looked to the right and shined his flashlight down there, and it was just all darkness and totally silent. The dinging was coming from the left side of the hallway. John swung the flashlight around and he shined it, and as soon as he looked down the hallway to the left side, his heart really began to race. Because remember, the power is off inside of his house, so all the lights and everything should be off. But as he was looking down the hallway, he saw there was bright light coming out from underneath his closed bedroom door. And also, that dinging sound was coming from in his bedroom. And his kids' iPads were not in there. At this point, John was terrified, but he knew he had to go in there. He had to see what was going on inside of his house. And so, very nervously, he began walking down the hallway towards the closed door. And as he's walking, the dinging sound is getting louder and louder. And with each ding from inside of his room, that light that was on inside of there would sort of pulsate. And you could see the light pulsating from underneath the door. And so John is getting more and more nervous as he's getting closer and closer to this door. And then right as he's about to touch the door and actually go inside, he hears a new sound. And it's coming from behind him. In fact, it's coming from downstairs. It was like this thumping sound, like something thick and meaty was like hitting the wooden floors over and over again. John's first thought was, maybe he left a window open downstairs and that was just the sound of the rain coming in. But as he's listening to this thumping sound that's getting louder and closer to him, making its way towards the stairs, he's thinking, that can't possibly be the rain. That does not make any sense. So he thought, oh, it's gotta be my dog. And so he called out to his dog again, this time much more urgently. Frankly, he wanted the comfort at this point, but the dog didn't come. And that thumping sound continued, and it began to go up the stairs. At this point, John knew he needs to go over and see who is now coming up the stairs. He has to go look. But he's paralyzed with fear. He's in the middle of this huge storm, the power's out, he has no idea what's going on with his wife and his kids, there's this escaped convict down the road, he has all these strange noises in his house, and so he just stands there completely unsure what to do. And then finally, as this thumping sound is right about to crest the stairs and be in the hallway, whatever or whoever it was, John turned and just threw open his door, figuring, at least if I go in my bedroom, I can shut the door and create space between me and whoever this is. But the second he charged into his bedroom, holding the flashlight over his head like a baseball bat, to confront whatever was in there, he just froze because what he saw in front of him was horrifying. To understand what John saw and why it was so bad, you have to know that overall, John was a pretty nice guy. He was a good father, a good husband, he gave to charity, he took in stray animals. He was the kind of guy who would, if you drop money out on the street, he'd pick it up and give it back to you. He's a good guy. But there was one aspect of his life where John wasn't so nice. In fact, you could make the case that he was sort of a monster himself. John, in one very specific way, was sort of a bully. Every day for the last 5 years, John had been personally bullying and torturing this one victim online, and then also riling up other people to do the same thing. And so on this night, when he flew into his bedroom to escape whatever else was going on in his house, what he saw in his bedroom that was so awful was his victim. And he knew for sure that his victim was here for revenge. John's victim turned attacker was standing right there in the middle of his bedroom, clutching John's dog in their fist, like they were about to squeeze the life out of her. And at the same time, the loud thumping sound that John had run away from into this room that was coming up the stairs, well, John heard it thump against the door to the bedroom. And so John realized that must be another attacker. There's 2 of them, and now I'm gonna die. And so instinctively, John whipped around and just stared at this door, getting ready for whoever this was to enter the room. And as the door began to swing open, John closed his eyes and put his hands up around his head, bracing for impact. And he's standing there literally waiting to die, but nothing happens. And after a few seconds, John, he opens his eyes and he looks around and he smiles. It would turn out the monster of Cell Block C really had escaped from that state prison during that riot. And after they got out, they went to John's house. But the monster of Cell Block C was not a dangerous, horrible criminal, at least not to John. In fact, the monster of Cell Block C was one of John's oldest friends, and he had broken out of prison for one reason: to save John, and his dog. Immediately after entering the bedroom, the monster of Cell Block C leapt onto the attacker who was holding John's dog hostage and managed to free the dog. The dog ran to safety, and then the monster of Cell Block C basically wrestled the attacker onto the ground and restrained them. And as they did this, John, who's sort of standing off to the side, is so relieved, but also he was suddenly inspired. And he had this idea that not only would defeat his attacker for good, but also would keep his friend, the monster of Cell Block C, from going back to prison. John turned and ran out of the bedroom and went into one of his kids' rooms where he grabbed a frog stuffed animal. He ripped the head off, and then he went back into his own bedroom and superglued the frog head onto the top of his attacker. John's attacker, the one he had bullied for so many years, who had come back for revenge, who was in his bedroom emitting pulsing lights and making dinging sounds and grabbed John's dog by their fist and held them hostage, was none other than the like button. John was actually John Allen, aka me, Mr. Ballin. And with that frog head superglued on top of the like button, now they looked a whole lot like the monster of Cell Block C, which of course was my best friend, Seagull Lung. And so when the police showed up a short time later, they carted away the like button because they looked like the monster of Cell Block C. To this day, the like button is still serving out old Lungy's prison sentence. And as for old Seagull Lung, he's somewhere on a beach in Mexico. And now that this story is over, I can finally say, April Fools. With Lungy now safe on a beach and the like button serving Lungy's prison sentence, I think it's safe to say that if you come after one of us, you face the wrath of both of us. So I have one thing to say to the like button, and that's, don't touch my frog. And so to celebrate that sentiment and to celebrate April Fool's Day, we have an exclusive and limited merch drop. We have this sweet graphic t-shirt that's sort of a reimagining of one of all of our favorite movies. I'm sure you can see the inspiration. And on the front, it says, John Ballin, don't touch my frog, okay? Pretty cool. There's also a poster as well with the same graphic. All you have to do is head on over to shopmrballin.com to get yourself a piece of this sweet merch drop.